Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Lanterman House. This is Mike Lawler.
Hello.
He is the president of the Historical Society of the Crescenta Valley, and he is my proud co-sponsor for today's event. We're so glad to welcome you all here. I'm just thrilled to see this many people here in the audience for a lecture about a topic in history. That's very exciting for us.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to the fact this is a topic that resonates with so many people. And just like you, I want to learn more about this. I want to be able to talk about this topic and face this history. And so we're really pleased to be able to put it on today. We try to do free lectures several times a year. So if you like what you hear today, come back. Next month, the first Sunday in November, we're doing another free lecture about Ernest Batchelder, the tile maker from Pasadena. And we're going to have on view for one day only selections of tile from the Bullock House, which was recently torn down on Palm Drive in La Cañada, but they saved the fireplace. So
You saved the fireplace.
Well, we hope you're able to come back for that. Also, we will be offering free mini tours of the house following the lecture. Put your name on the list and I'll give you instructions afterwards. It's not the whole tour, you'll have to come back to get the whole tour, but if you've never been here before, it's worthwhile to peek inside and enjoy that. We hope you enjoy today. If you can always become a member of the Historical Society of the Crescenta Valley or the Lanterman House. It is your memberships are the reason why we are able to put on programming like this for all to enjoy. So, with that pitch, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Lawler, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
You know, it is timely, these types of lectures about, the somewhat darker side of history. And it's kind of because we haven't explored that side of our history very much, that we have a whole new realm to talk about. It's wonderful. And it's the history that we can learn from. This is the real history we can learn from. And so our historian today is a woman historian, an LA-based woman historian, Becky Nicolaides. And she got her PhD in history from Columbia University out in New York. And she went on to Arizona and then back to California at UC San Diego. And she has consulted extensively. City of LA, State of California, LA Conservancy, and she's the founding partner of a woman-led consulting company called History Studio. She's everywhere. She's everywhere doing everything, but her specialty is suburbia, exactly where we are and where all of us live. She recently served on the LA Civic Memory Working Group run out of Mayor Garcetti's office, and she had a very famous book that came out a few years ago called My Blue Heaven. I'd heard of it extensively. And she's got a new book coming out, a third book called The New Suburbia, LA's Suburbs Since 1945. So let's welcome Becky Nicolaides.
It's on. Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I especially want to thank Laura and Mike for the invitation and all of you for coming out on this beautiful day that actually feels a little like fall after all the heat we've been having. And I also want to thank Julie and Mary Lou for sharing their insights on local history and some really terrific archival sources, some of which I'm going to be sharing in the talk here. I also just wanted to acknowledge the EU Erasmus Plus program, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of my first slide here. I'm part of a program called Urbanism and Suburbanism in the EU countries and abroad. We're basically a transnational group of scholars studying cities and suburbs from a global perspective. And this talk is going to become part of our sort of project results of that grant. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to do this. There's a sign-up sheet that I think maybe some of you might have signed. I really would appreciate it if you're able to, if you're comfortable doing that, that's great. It's just a way for the grantors to sort of document that like this event took place and how many people showed up basically. So, okay, well, I'm so happy to be here to be talking about this topic, which is Mike mentioned very accurately. I think this is sometimes an uncomfortable topic, but I think it's so important that we sort of learn the details of how something like segregation worked and kind of played out in so many communities. I'm going to be talking about La Cañada and La Crescenta specifically, but also making reference to a lot of other suburban areas in LA, which has been the focus of my research for the past number of years. So we'll kind of get, I think, a feel of what was going on locally here, but also see how what was happening here was very much part of much broader patterns happening, not just in LA, but really across the entire country. So I want to just start out by sharing a story that I dug up out of the LA Times from 1958. In 1958, a reporter from the Times named Dick Degnan descended on La Crescenta to write a profile of this post-war suburb. And when you read this article, it really sounds like something out of Leave It to Beaver from the 1950s. There's that very popular TV sitcom at the time. He honed in on the 3700 block of Anderson Avenue, where he described an almost idyllic life there. There were tight-knit, happy, caring community had blossomed, very typical of what he described as the sort of help your neighbor trend in suburban living after World War II. Neighbors on that block did a lot together. They did weekend boating trips with each other. Moms shared recipes and cooking tips. Dads helped each other with DIY home improvement projects. There were the daily coffee clatches and the regular block parties, and people were constantly borrowing and lending things from sugar to barbecues. So as he summed it up, it was all part of a bright new way of living. And I think in so many ways, this profile really reflected everything positive about the post-war suburban good life in America, with the kind, caring neighbors, the close community, the whole culture of sharing and all of that. But just as typical here was the racial profile of La Crescenta at the time. It was all white. Neighboring La Cañada had a similar racial profile at the time. Now, Degnan did not mention this demography in his profile. I think it was kind of a given at that time that that was the reality in so many suburbs in post-war Los Angeles. But I think it's so important to recognize that that racial demography really created a crucial social context for these towns, and it created a sense of social comfort within the community among people who looked just like each other when it came to race. And I would argue allowed for that tight-knit community to blossom. That racial context was so important. This was such a pervasive reality of American suburbs that the suburban dream very much rested on a kind of social basis of racial segregation and exclusion. Segregation, I would say, was as much a part of the American dream in the suburbs as the barbecues and the nice neighbors. And that segregation was the norm, a very assumed part of local life that many people, I think, really did take for granted. And while it's true that towns like La Cañada and La Crescenta, Glendale, La Crescenta, Glendale, and Pasadena had moments of racial extremism, like after World War II. Mike's work has shown this so well in his books, where you'd see showing up white supremacists, the KKK. I found a photo of Nazis doing a parade through Pasadena. I think it was in the 70s. But I think even more than those extremists, I think even more significant were the everyday practices that created and perpetuated segregation and became a normal part of everyday life. So by the 1950s, when Degnan was writing this profile, the tools and the practices and the policies that created this segregation had become very normalized and had even been sanctioned by the federal government at that point. And while the federal government was starting to dismantle some of that by the 50s, the time of Degnan's piece, in the gradual movement towards fair housing, a lot of the residue was still there, and really, I would argue some of that residue even remains to our own time. This was a harsh history, and I think in a lot of ways it can be difficult to confront, but I think it's so worth doing as a really important step toward reckoning with the past and opening pathways for truly inclusive communities. So I want to share some of this history to talk about the various ways that the suburbs perpetuated racial exclusion in their communities. And then I'm going to talk briefly about sort of recent trends towards demographic diversity. And then finally, I'm going to end up with some ideas about like what things communities might be able to do to promote greater acceptance and inclusivity within our neighborhoods. Okay, whoa, okay. So, sure I remember to forward the slides. Okay, so I want to describe some of the ways that racial exclusion was established and then perpetuated in towns like La Cañada and La Crescenta and a lot of other suburbs within LA. For the most part, these efforts started at the local level, often with the guidance of realtors, and then it kind of percolated all the way up to the federal government, again with realtors playing a really important role in those policies. And I think it's so important to keep in mind that these patterns did not just happen naturally, that people didn't naturally gravitate towards certain areas as the courts for decades seemed to think, but rather they really resulted from deliberate practices and policies and policy choices that put racial barriers around white suburbs and in turn confined people of color to segregated neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods in turn generally suffered from inferior and underfunded schools, public resources, housing, and conditions that was not always the case in the white suburbs. And at the same time that all this was happening, these policies began associating suburb in the public mind with white. So there was this kind of racial construction that was happening in a very powerful way. There were a lot of motivations that were driving this by suburban homeowners at the time, including racism, fears of race mixing, the belief that if a person of color moved into a white neighborhood, that property values would drop. That's what some historians call the racial theory of property value. And even though there's a ton of evidence that proves otherwise, it was a very strongly held belief at the time, and that was often the language that was used to rationalize these defensive actions that these communities would take to impose segregation on them. So, okay, let's take a look at these tools, and then I'm going to start with local efforts. And some of the examples I'm going to share come from the Foothills suburbs, and then some from other communities in LA, as I mentioned. So one of the first tools were developer initiatives. So developers were a really key player in all of this. They were one of the first groups to initiate these efforts. So they came up with things like restrictive clauses in property deeds that would regulate how a person could use their individual property. And so it might say, you had to have a minimum lot size or a certain setback or fencing or minimum construction costs or whatever that might look like in those deeds. And then they also began in the early 20th century to begin including provisions about race, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But they mentioned race restrictions often in their advertisements for real estate development so that racial exclusion becomes something of a selling point of suburban developments. So one early example is Windsor Hills, which behind me was the kind of prospectus for that development. And I don't know if you can read it, but the very first line states, let me just make sure I can read that. It says basically Caucasian race only. So that's number one consideration in that, Windsor Hills prospectus. In Westwood, the Jan's Corporation, or the Jan's Investment Company used racial covenants widely when it was developing Westwood. In Eagle Rock, there's many examples of this. People have written quite extensively about this for LA. In Eagle Rock, there was a 1920s ad that was placed by the developers that basically said, and I'm going to quote, as you journey about Eagle Rock, you will observe that the residents are all of the white race. Again, race was a selling point for the community. And then, of course, there was this billboard for Flint Ridge, which mentions protective restrictions, which was very much at the time understood to include race. And as late as the 1950s, when suburban development was skyrocketing after World War II, some of the largest developers of mass-produced suburban tracts in LA simply refused to sell property to people of color. This included Milton Brock Builders, Lakewood Village Builders, and Julian Weinstock Builders, among others. And so that practice essentially closed off a huge segment of the booming housing market to people of color at a time really when suburbanization was truly taking off here and nationally. Okay, a second tool, and this was a big one, were race restrictive covenants or residential deed restrictions. So some of you, I think, are really familiar with this. I think I heard Kyle, you were mentioning it. So basically, a race restrictive covenant was a legal provision that was written into a property deed that basically put a restriction on what a new buyer of a home could do with their property. So in terms of building, land use, and who the property could be sold to. So the racial element basically said that if you bought a property, and this is an image from Mike's book. Thank you for putting that in your book. So this is a quote from this sort of deed restriction. It basically says, if you buy my property, you basically agree not to sell it to a person of color. And the phrasing in the deeds usually said that you agree to sell it to a person not of the Caucasian race. That was the kind of language that they typically used. So this deed was a private, legally binding agreement between the buyer and the seller of the property. And that made it a legal agreement for sure. So usually these restrictions were intended to run with the land. Even after the property might be sold again to multiple owners, that deed would stay with that property. Typically they lasted from 20 to 30 years. Sometimes they specified the expiration date, but sometimes they lasted in perpetuity. It really varied. How effective were these covenants? That's a question historians have, dug into for sure. The answer is it really varied according to a couple things. One is how determined the whites in the community were to enforce them, and the other factor was how determined people of color were to try to breach them and to just try to kind of get into the community anyway, even despite those things in place, the covenants in place. But in most cases, they were enforced, especially after the 1920s. And there were two key court rulings that helped bolster their power. There was one case in 1919 where the California Supreme Court upheld the use of race restrictive covenants And then in 1926, the U.S. Supreme Court actually upheld their use in Corrigan versus Buckley. The end result, I think, was captured really well in the words of one African American who lived in South LA, and he put it like this. He said that covenants created invisible walls of steel. The whites surround us and makes it impossible for us to go beyond these walls. So I think that really powerfully captures the kind of impact that these covenants had, which were quite pervasive across Los Angeles. So in 1948, the covenants were finally declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Shelley versus Kramer case, but even that ruling had certain weaknesses regarding enforcement, and in some ways, the practice could still persist even after that important ruling was handed down. Okay, make sure I'm on my right slide. Okay, now, covenants were only effective when all the property owners in an area kind of agreed to use them. And so one way that neighbors tried to enforce that cooperation was to form neighborhood protective associations or homeowner associations, also AKA homeowner associations, to help enforce these covenants. Some of these protective associations were openly bigoted, like this one in Hollywood, which you can see in the picture here. And what these groups did was essentially bring group pressure to bear on individual homeowners to say, hey, you need to be making sure your covenant is in place, that it's renewed, and that everything is there, and that, so that we can trust each other to kind of keep our entire neighborhood blanketed with these deeds and the race restrictions on them. Now, in La Cañada, the Chamber of Commerce played a similar role as these protective associations. And I have to thank Laura and Julie and Mary Lou for pointing out to me, and I know Mike's book does this as well, that Frank Lanterman was actually was president of the Chamber of Commerce at the time that many of these actions were happening. And I have to thank Laura and Mary Lou and Julie for giving me sources that helped help me kind of dig into the story a little bit. So, and that story of what happened is actually quite striking. In 1941, the La Cañada Chamber of Commerce launched a race restriction campaign in 2 phases. The first in the spring, and then the second phase in November, which was just a month before Pearl Harbor. There's some remarkable articles about this in the Crescenta Valley Ledger, which basically described how their campaign worked. Now, as I was reading the coverage of this, I was struck there was an editorial in the Ledger that kind of framed the whole issue. And it basically said, hey, the residents here are not expressing narrow-minded prejudice, but they're, quote, merely taking steps which they deem necessary to ensure a future of peace and happiness in La Cañada Valley, end quote. Why was this campaign launched in 1941? Well, it was a time when the racial covenants in the area were starting to expire. Apparently, the local deeds had an expiration date that was put in place by the original subdividers. So by 41, some of them were beginning to expire. And they were also, the Chamber of Commerce was also taking cues from local communities and similar campaigns happening in places like Flint Ridge, Pasadena, Glendale, Alhambra, and South Pasadena, which were launching similar covenant reinforcing campaigns. Now, the rationale that they expressed in this campaign here in La Cañada was, of course, to protect property values. That was always an old favorite and standard with these things. to prevent social problems that come with race mixing, and to keep the schools free of race problems. One editorial stated that, quote, when folks of one race force their way amongst other racial groups, there is often discontent and bitterness. So this was the sort of discourse that was being, kind of shared in the community around the issue, and to kind of get people on board and behind the campaign. Local officials also stated that if an area was blanketed with restrictions, the possibility that non-Caucasians would invade were slim. So the Chamber of Commerce basically coordinated the entire campaign. It went around and charged residents $4 to handle the pulling of deeds and the paperwork. And it also the chamber worked to set up a volunteer committee and a series of committees in each neighborhood in order to go door to door to get neighbors to sign on and pay the $4 fee so that the covenants could be strengthened and made sure that they were in place. All in all, the chamber stated that this will make La Cañada a better place to live by keeping race problems out of the community. Okay, so moving on. Another tool of exclusion that was used widely, or that was a very powerful force in the creation of segregation, were real estate practices. Realtors were all over this issue. They played a huge role in the creation and perpetuation of segregation. So one practice that was common was known as steering. This was the practice where a realtor simply would show a property in a white community to a person of color, and they would be steered away. And in a similar way, in all Protestant suburbs, like Jews and Catholics would be steered away. So it was kind of happening in multiple directions here. Realtors also made racial discrimination a part of their professional ethics. In 1924, the National Association of Realtor Boards established a code of ethics that essentially prohibited any realtor from introducing, quote, members of any race or nationality to a neighborhood that might threaten property values. And if a realtor violated this professional code of ethics, he could lose his license. This was the case in 32 states, and this code of ethics would stay in effect all the way up through the 1950s. Another tool that was used to create segregation was zoning. In the early 20th century, zoning was used as a blatant sort of tool of racial separation. There was something actually called racial zoning that was used in a number of eastern cities especially, basically using municipal power to exclude people of color from the community totally. Now in 1917, the US Supreme Court struck down racial zoning in a case called Buchanan versus Worley. But what that decision did was basically trigger a more widespread use of the race restrictive covenants. So when zoning was declared like unconstitutional, people just turned to the covenants as the other tool that they could use. Some people have also argued that another type of zoning called exclusionary zoning, which basically restricts neighborhoods to very, expensive large properties, has also kind of implicitly contributed to racial segregation by excluding multifamily housing and consequently many low-income people. Okay, the next tool, if we can call it that, was violence and intimidation. Historians have documented many, many examples of white residents using physical intimidation and force to keep people of color from buying property in their neighborhoods. I found evidence in Pasadena in the early 1900s. There were 3 black-owned homes that were burned to the ground in a transitioning area. This slide shows the home of the bombed out home of William Bailey in South LA. He was a school teacher and a World War II veteran who was essentially basically trying to move into a white neighborhood. And that was the reception that he got. In this photo, a white mob had assembled outside of the home of a black family that had recently moved into that white neighborhood, really, creating a feeling of hostility and threat, obviously, to this family. In 1947, the LA Urban League identified 26 techniques that white homeowners were using to keep black home seekers out of their communities. Bombings, death threats, vandalism, cross burnings, paying off neighbors to not sell their house to black Americans or other people of color, and on and on. These types of attacks and this kind of violence peaked in the 1950s and 1960s, which again was kind of the heyday of the suburban era in America. So altogether, all of these initiatives, these local initiatives, were so important, I think, for setting a critical groundwork for racial exclusion, and turned many LA suburbs into sundown towns, meaning that towns might allow people of color there during the day to work or that kind of thing, but when the sun went down, they had to get out of town, that they were not allowed to live in the community. Okay. Now, in the 1930s, the federal government enters the picture, and it becomes involved in reinforcing these tools and throwing the weight of the national government itself behind all of these practices. And I think it's fair to say that federal policy didn't initiate segregation, but it certainly played a role in reinforcing it once the federal government got into the act of housing policy during the Depression in the 1930s. So I just want to just kind of briefly talk you through this and how this worked and what it looked like. So there were two New Deal agencies that were key here. And it's kind of interesting to keep in mind that this was the very first time that the federal government had gotten involved in the private real estate market. And when they did so in a very racialized way. So these two agencies, the first was the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It was set up in 1933, established during the Depression. Its main purpose was to protect homeowners who were on the verge of foreclosure of their homes. So the HOLC would come in, they would refinance the mortgage, or if the house had already been lost to foreclosure, the HOLC would grant low interest loans to help them kind of get the house back. And then the second of the agencies was the FHA, which is still around. And that was, of course, the more important and longer lasting agency in this whole story. Instead of lending money, the FHA insured mortgages by private banks. Okay, so what happened here is that the HOLC came up with a system of appraising neighborhoods as security risks for these loans. So they were essentially asking, is this neighborhood a good risk in terms of lending money here? Should we underwrite loans here or give loans in this neighborhood? And a neighborhood's rating would determine how easy it would be for residents to get these federal loans, to be part of these federal programs. So what happened is, in the late 1930s, the HOLC sent appraisers out to every neighborhood of every major city in the United States to rate them. And they filled out worksheets as part of that rating and appraising of the community. And it was this rating system that was so important because it established a kind of federal policy about the types of neighborhoods and people who the government felt were worthy recipients of these programs. And just as significant as the as the HOLC program, is that the HOLC appraisal system would influence the FHA and the decisions that private banks would make in lending money for home mortgages. So that was kind of the longer lasting impact in that. So I want to kind of talk you guys through what this looked like. So this was the rating system. It was A, B, C, D. An A or green rating was basically given to a neighborhood that was newer, it was socially homogenous, tended to be WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, an upper class. Usually there was no industry in sight, and they tended to be suburban. So single-family homes, the feds loved those single-family homes. And then in the B areas, they were considered still desirable, but they had reached their peak, but they seemed to have a kind of stable future. Now, in a C area, and I'm quoting them, a C area was definitely declining. Maybe it was because of age or because they were attracting what the HOLC deemed undesirable populations into the area. The D or red rating was basically the opposite of A. So these were communities that were diverse. They often had people of color. Industry might be nearby. There was often mixed housing, so you'd have rentals as well as single-family homes. They were just often more heterogeneous kinds of places. They could often be middle or working class. As long as people of color were there, especially Black Americans, a community would automatically get a red rating. It didn't matter if it was middle class, if the homes were beautiful, and there were neighborhoods in Pasadena that fit that characterization that got the red rating. The red rating is the origins of the term redlining. That's where this comes from, this original HOLC appraisal system. Okay, I want to just share a few maps with you. So I don't know if you guys can see this with the reflection. This is the map of central LA. So like downtown is that white area that's kind of open right there. That's downtown, and then this is South LA. Watts is right around here, I think. I'm probably not placing it perfectly. And then, these are the green areas would be like in this kind of the Foothills, Hollywood, Bel Air, all the Santa Monica Mountain areas and this kind of thing. But that's central LA. And then this is a map of kind of closer to here. So this is the east San Fernando Valley, North Hollywood. I don't want to pull up what you guys are seeing. I'm going to zoom in here, but we can see La Crescenta, La Cañada, and Flint Ridge. And then I'm zooming in here on La Crescenta, La Cañada, Flint Ridge is here, and then this is northwest Pasadena, that red area. Wow. So what I did is, I don't know if you guys got the handouts, because I want to kind of talk you through what these worksheets look like. If you want to grab the handout, these are basically the original HOLC appraisal worksheets that were done in 1939. And I included an A, B, C, and D worksheet just to give you an example of kind of the language and what these look like. And so I've included, I want to just talk you through how to look at this. So if you look at the bottom, which like where it says area number right at the bottom, there's one that says A6, if you can see where I'm pointing. Could you guys see that? A6 at the bottom. So that basically tells you that it got an A rating, and then it's basically that green splotch right there. So you see the identifier at the bottom, and then same with the other sheets. So if you look at like there's one. So yeah, A6 is basic. East Glen Oaks is Flint Ridge. So B26 is that it's this one right here, above the green one. That's B26. And then C14 is that part of La Crescenta. And then the last one I included was of that area of Northwest Pasadena, which was D6. I wanted you to see the language that was utilized in how a red area was talked about. So I would just suggest take a minute and look at like the language used. And even when I teach my class on this, I kind of ask the students to think about like what are even the categories of the blank, the things that they're supposed to fill in, right? So, and these were all done, the date is in the very lower right. But you can see quite a bit. I mean, does anyone want to chime in on anything they're seeing on their? Oh yeah. Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. I should have been using the mic. Are you seeing anything that's striking you in the language or anything? Yeah.
Well, I'm really struck by on page 4, which is the on page 4, which is the red district. In the description and characteristics of area, it says the let me read this. Is where the Negro race is described in an official government document as subversive, like the race itself is subversive.
That's right.
So
Can't hear you.
Oh,
it might not be ours.
yeah. She just mentioned that the black race was referred to as subversive, and I think in terms of this rating standard, that was the case. It was seen. There was a very racialized dimension to how these communities were being judged as risks. I think, I don't know. Hopefully it'll work.
Were these documents publicly available at the time?
So he's asking if the documents were publicly available. The mic's kind of going in and out. I don't know what's going on. Oh, here it is. Oh, okay, sorry. That's a great question. So, no is the short answer at the time. So, when I was in grad school at Columbia University and I studied with a guy named Kenneth Jackson, who wrote this really great book on suburban history called Crabgrass Frontier, he's the first scholar who went to the National Archives to declassify these documents. And so that would have been probably like in the late 70s. His book came out in 1985 or 84 or 85, and he was the first historian to really dig into these documents. So I think I will say they weren't really publicly available. However, they were definitely circulated amongst banking circles, realtor circles, that the information sort of was getting around, partly because what's remarkable about this is that the people doing a lot of the appraisals were, guess what? Realtors. So they were imposing their own sense of these communities, and it was this sort of self-fulfilling thing that was going on, this circular process of reinforcing all of this. Any other thoughts or questions or anything? Yeah, Mike.
You said that this is available online as well.
Yeah, it is available now. It's very widely known about and available. There's a website. Sorry, I'll wait till that passes. There's a website. I think I took it off the PowerPoint. I should have left it on. I'm trying to remember the name of the project, but there's a group of historians who digitized all of this information, and it's all readily accessible online. And you can look up like any neighborhood in LA or really nationally. They've done it for the entire country. I can probably email it to you, Laura, and maybe you could make it some available somewhere. So yeah. Any other thoughts or reactions? Yeah, Kyle.
I noticed on the stuff they got the A grade, they get the A grade in spite of them saying that there are risks of flood in the area, there's no transportation, there's no businesses nearby, and so all the stuff that we would say, you need that, no, it's not.
That doesn't matter, right? Yeah, so, yeah, totally. So, there's very distinct value judgments that were, I think, imposed on this whole system. Anyone else? Yeah.
Are there histories or oral histories of the people that did the ratings?
Oh, that's such a great question. She's asking if there's histories or oral histories of people who did the ratings. I'm not aware of. That would be an amazing project. Maybe many of these people have probably passed because these were done in, the date, April of 1939. But that would, I don't know. I mean, I haven't run across anything like that, and I think historians would have kind of been all over that if that existed. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, just reading in the A6 first page, where you said the mortgage funds, it says ample for those areas, and then on the last page that we were talking about, rated lower, mortgage funds were limited.
Yeah.
For sure.
So they're telling you about money won't be available here in those areas.
Again, it's like a self-reinforcing system. I think that was operating. That's a great observation. So I taught many years these documents. Students are always kind of blown away when they see this. It's very, I mean, it's hard to read some of the language. If you're looking at, I just pulled these four. I mean, there's language in some of the other communities of LA that it's so over the top, value laden, racist. There's a lot of bad things that are kind of going on in those documents. So I guess, we can kind of ask, what was the outcome of all of these policies from the local to the federal level? And I think, obviously the results were wide-ranging. They created stark segregation across LA suburbs. They exacerbated inequality in the process. I don't know how to stick that in. Oh, pop it. Okay, got it, sorry. And I, when I crunched a bunch of census data for my book research, and when I looked at the data from the 1950s and 60s, nearly every suburb across LA County was heavily white. And I included a table of that demography here in the handout. If you look at this table 1, it basically lists the percentage of non-Hispanic whites in all of the existing incorporated communities of Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s. I mean, this is a result of those practices and policies. It's pretty stark, and I think even if you the following handout after that one, or the following table after that shows the numbers for La Crescenta and La Cañada, which were very much in line with those trends across the county. So the other impact of this is it created huge barriers for people of color. So in areas like housing, at a time in history when suburbanization was spreading rapidly, people of color were essentially excluded from FHA loans. So from I don't know if you guys can hear me with that. Okay. From 1934 to 1962, the FHA insured less than 2% of its loans to non-whites. So it basically meant that home ownership was way harder for people of color to attain at that time. And as a result, it cut off a key source of generational wealth for that segment of the population. People of color, as I mentioned earlier, were often relegated to neighborhoods that had fewer resources, that had less wealth, with under-resourced schools and services and infrastructure. And a lot of those effects continued for decades. So, for example, red line neighborhoods tended to be targeted when it came to things like redevelopment, or where freeways would be placed, or where toxic, dump sites might be located as well. You can still kind of see the footprint of that if we look at, yeah, I mean, just kind of looking at the basic map of LA, it's definitely, those policies left a huge footprint. And I was involved with a study that was commissioned by LA City for its housing element. And what we did was we took the redlining maps and then we superimposed like the routes of freeways and that kind of thing, and it just matched up exactly. I mean, it's kind of uncanny how long lasting the impact of that has been. So I just also want to mention there's a great book on all of this called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, who really focuses on government policy and this whole story, and he talks quite a bit about all the parameters of these federal policies especially. Okay, so I know, oh my gosh, it's already getting late, I'm sorry. Okay, so in recent decades, I do want to mention that things have started to change, and a lot of suburbs have diversified in terms of race and ethnicity and even class. Poverty has actually moved to a lot of suburbs. Since the 1980s, most suburbs have seen a rise in LA in the number of Latinos and Asians, and to a lesser extent, Black Americans, although neighborhood segregation still tends to persist. You can see some of that data looking at like La Crescenta and La Cañada, and there has been progress, and I think that is a good thing. In my own work on this story for LA and how LA suburbs have historically dealt with these changes, I found that a lot of communities still have a lot of homework to do when it comes to creating inclusive and welcoming communities for all. And so I want to turn finally to some steps that communities can take to promote racial inclusion. And this is really coming from a place of seeing diversity as a strength, as a force for promoting different perspectives and cultures and opportunities for all people. So just to share this final set of thoughts with you, first of all, communities can promote inclusion through diverse housing. This is so important, I think. We have such a housing crisis right now in LA and California. And I think to help alleviate this crisis, it's so important for towns to work flexibly with local zoning measures to allow in affordable housing and to pursue inclusionary zoning as opposed to exclusionary zoning, which sort of is their way of fulfilling their own requirement that all towns provide their fair share of affordable housing. So people who would love to move into La Cañada, for example, including people who work here, cleaning homes, teaching children, putting out fires, for those folks, housing is often simply unaffordable. And that housing jobs mismatch not only keeps those folks out of these communities, but it poses huge problems for traffic, climate change. People are forced to commute long distances because they can't afford to live near where they work. So even though they may not yet live in these communities, so nobody is representing that voice at City Hall, their interests should still be kept in mind by residents who are here and who care about, racial equity and inclusion in the community. Another thing is to listen to people of color in the community. What are their goals and aspirations? Is this community supporting those goals? I think it's so important for a community to understand the culture of local residents, Black Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and hold listening sessions and ask, how is this suburb supporting or not supporting your needs? Are ethnic entrepreneurs, for example, being supported? Related to this is to incorporate their history into the community's history. In so many cases, it's not done. I've encountered this quite a bit in my own research on my book. One approach to do this kind of thing might be to do oral histories with residents of color in the community. Maybe have high school students participate in that kind of thing, working with the local history teachers in the schools, doing a kind of public history project. Maybe you guys have done this here at the Lanterman House, I'm not sure, but I think it sounds to me like that could be a really wonderful way to kind of create a more inclusive local history. Another thing that could be done is to really kind of conscientiously promote human relations work. What does this mean? It means working proactively to promote positive race relations. You might form a human relations committee or commission. One thing I found in my book research was that when Proposition 13 was passed back in 1978, LA County lost a lot of funding that had gone into human relations work. And that happened right at the moment when the suburbs really began to diversify. So what it meant was that a lot of communities just had to figure it out without any kind of help about how to do it. What I found was that towns that worked proactively in the realm of human relations really had better success in creating racially inclusive environments than compared to those that basically ignored the issue and just didn't deal with it at all. That was probably more common too. And you know, another example of this kind of effort would be to create ongoing venues or events or social gatherings to promote interracial interaction and community building. And then finally, learn about the town's past. So a step like this, or a step like this talk, I think is a great start, and the work you all have been doing, Laura, I know, here at Lanterman House, of just to raise awareness of how our own communities have been caught up in these practices. Suburban history is full of racial transgressions, so learning about how our communities have been complicit in this, I think, is such a key step towards change. And then towns can take this knowledge and act on it. Open a community dialogue about how to redress this past. I know, Kyle, you guys are going to start doing that. Some suburbs have acknowledged past wrongs in an official way. So some great examples recently. In 2020, Glendale issued a resolution apologizing for its history of racial exclusion. In that same year, this was, you know, the year of George Floyd, Lakewood did a town hall listening session on race relations there, which was quite powerful. In February of 2022, South Pasadena approved a resolution condemning its history as a sundown town and its practices of institutional racism. And of course, you guys probably saw in the news in this past June, in Manhattan Beach, they returned Bruce's Beach to the original black family that was deposed of that land 100 years earlier. So I would just close by saying, you know, when the motivation and the will is there, a lot of positive good, I think, can come out of it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share this history. Any questions?
Are there questions? Yeah, raise your hand. If you need to go, no one will take offense if you quietly stand up and sidle off. But if anybody has questions or comments?
Did your research find out anything about the establishment of the Bucknell School District in connection to busing?
Yeah. Yes. And Mary Lou and we kind of had a bit of a conversation about that. I know Mary Lou has done quite a bit of research on that. So I have a take on it that might disagree a little bit with Mary Lou's, but not totally. But my understanding is what happened was that in 1960-61, La Cañada broke off to form its own school district when the Pasadena district was going through that painful process of trying to conform to the Brown versus Board of Education mandate, which was from 1954. So just to get the chronology, 54 was Brown, and then by the early 60s, a lot of communities were in turmoil trying to deal with how to fulfill the Brown mandate, including Pasadena. And it's a kind of complicated history. I actually have one of my chapters in my book is on Pasadena, my case studies, so I get into the weeds in that, on that history quite a bit. So I think part of what happened is La Cañada schools broke off in the thick of a lot of that. I think some of the rationales that were used at the time were, you know, concerns about taxes. I mean, Mary Lou, you have a better sense of that, I think even.
Sure.
Yeah, come on up.
There was a state law that was passed that very simply said that school districts, La Cañada had its own elementary school district and had for years. And its junior high and high school went to Pasadena. And a law was passed that the state wanted these small elementary school districts to do a couple of things. First of all, they had to make some choices, and they had to either choose to form their own unified school district, K through 12, or they could decide to join a neighboring school district. And the neighboring school district was Glendale or Pasadena. During the 1950s, like all these suburban communities, the population of these suburban communities like South Pass and Monrovia and all these areas grew, just huge population growth. And we had reached that population size, and we're about the same numbers, 19,000, 20,000, 21,000 for all over this period of time, which were enough population base to be able to form your own school district. And so because there was a clock ticking in terms of the state law, they had to, in the midst of what she also said, there are many themes weaving through this, but they also had to make some choices. And so the best choice is to choose for yourself what you wanted to do, and so hence they held an election and a vote, and they chose to form their own school district. It just happens at that time. And the issue is, to what degree was it motivated by concerns concerning race and diversity that you would find in Pasadena? We have searched long and hard through all the newspapers and public documents, and we haven't found only one quote. However, we all know that newspapers don't report the mindset of the people that are sitting at their kitchen tables or at the grocery store talking over the checkout line about how they feel about something like that. And so that's stuff that's undocumented. And that's where oral histories come in, of trying to find those people to get their take on this, to what degree and how does that work. And so it's a story that we need to find. The only problem is with this is a lot of those people are, look at the dates, and they're just not physically around anymore to get that story. So to be able to document to what degree, we can't. But you get the take on the community, and you have to know that it was part of probably a lot of discussion that was going on. And so it was a lot of factors and a lot of complex history. And the whole history of the Pasadena School District at this time is probably the most difficult story to unpack.
Yeah.
To do that. So you have to, and we're always trying to do that. So we leave it with those facts. We leave it with the understanding that there was some need to make a decision, and the concern of taxes and what the causes were among community members. We really can't tell on that.
I would just add, I'll just add a couple things to that though. I think, first of all, it's really difficult to get people in an oral history to talk about, like now, in our current time, to like talk honestly about their racial attitudes that they might have had. I've done it a little bit, but it's very challenging. The other piece that I dug up a little bit on this, just to, because I was really curious about that question. I kind of had the assumption that what you said, that, you know, La Cañada's breakaway was racially motivated. And then I spoke with Mary Lou about it. The only thing I would add is I dug around a little, and to me, one important piece of evidence was the issue of who was the La Cañada's district first superintendent, and that was Max Rafferty.
There you go.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't like really dug super deep into that, but I know he's been written about by historians like Michelle Nickerson and Lisa McGurr, who portray him as a right-wing extremist. I mean, there's quotes in the LA Sentinel about him that he sort of didn't believe that the state should get involved in race issues around the schools. This is like in the early 60s, which was very out of touch with kind of what was happening. So all I would say is that I think it's definitely, I mean, the black press was really critical of Max Rafferty. He actually went on to serve as, I think, superintendent of the California school system. So all I would say is I think it's an area that could definitely be researched more, and just a kind of fuller picture told of what was happening. I don't know, maybe I'm opening a can of worms on that.
You may be opening a can of worms because it has been talked about, but it hasn't been talked about in the mainstream, as you just said. I served as executive producer of a documentary that just came out, was just released to the general public.
On KCET.
It is available on KCET to stream.
Is this the Muir High School?
Yeah. I actually went to Muir, and I know the gentleman who made it's called Can We All Get Along? Not can't with a T, but can, C-A-N. And that's kind of based on Rodney King's phrase from back in 1992. And what it does is it examines his path of having gone through Muir, having been like the first generation of busing at Muir, and then exploring whether or not he would send his now, I think, 12-year-old son to the Pasadena Public Schools. And he goes into a lot of it, a great deal, and it's from a different perspective entirely. And I think a lot of people who have seen it are saying now, I didn't know this, but this information is there, and it's been talked about, but it hasn't been mainstreamed.
Right.
So yeah. I recommend you guys watch it if you can.
It's really great. I've seen it. It's
it's streaming on kcet.org, and it's called Can We All Get Along? And he talks a great deal about how La Cañada High School kind of came about based on people not wanting to send their children to Muir.
I think what part of what might be going on with this is maybe the perception, especially in communities of color at the time, is that was the motivation.
Yeah.
Maybe from the perspective of La Cañada, it was seen differently, but I think if you're talking to more people about this and trying to tease out coverage and different news sources, and I mean, I looked up Max Rafferty in the LA Sentinel, and there was a lot of negative stuff written about him. So, you know, it's just, I don't know. It's one of these things, I think, where the more we can dig and kind of try to find things from different points of view, you can get to some kind of truth about things. Yeah.
By the time they made that decision in 61, they'd already locked in their ability to exclude people of color with their deeds and their all of the stuff. So they all felt pretty comfortable with that. So that's why it probably wasn't a big discussion. They'd already locked that in. And then once they did the incorporation or the school district, they were like, that's great. Didn't have to talk a lot about it. He might have been controversial, and I guess, you know, he may have been who he was, but I think all the people probably didn't make a big deal of it because they felt pretty comfortable in their you know, with their deeds and all of those things that have been put in place decades you know, before.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good
I
point.
don't know, that's my perception.
Yeah, in the back.
So do you know anything, and if you do, can you talk a little bit about the realtors and the love letters, the California Association of Realtors and the use of love letters? Do you know anything about that? The use of love letters by realtors?
Yeah, it's website.
Well, do you, anyone else know that can speak sort of from landowners? No? Well, what it is that California, so what happens?
Could you stand up, or maybe you want to come up here?
If they could repeat the question.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
We can't hear them.
Come on up.
And it has to be
So what I was saying is about love letters, and for those who live in La Cañada, that, you know, our realtors will ask you to write lovely letters to the homeowners. And in those letters, you will show a picture of yourself and your family and talk about it. And those letters actually promulgate the exclusion to this day. And so if you're buying now, the California Association of Realtors several years ago made that illegal. But our realtors are actually circumventing that and just telling homeowners, do it yourself, we won't send it, etc. So I assume that if you're here, you care about these issues, but that's something to be aware of, is the love letters as you're selling your home and as you're trying to buy in the community. To talk to your realtors about that, because that's something that still happens and it's not supposed to. That's all.
That's a great point. Thank you.
I think just kind of peripherally related to that, another thing that's still happening is when a house gets appraised, this is going on right now, there's been evidence that it'll get a lower appraisal if the owner is a person of color than if white. In fact, one of my good friends, Nathan Connolly, he's a professor, I'm forgetting where, but he's written on this whole issue, and that happened to him, and his case was covered in the New York Times recently. I think they're suing. So there's ways that like these practices are still with us. They're just happening in maybe more insidious kind of ways that aren't maybe quite as obvious, but that are still impacting, you know, fairness in the housing market, fair access, all of that. So, yeah. Yeah.
There are two small points I wanted to make. The first one was, because it happened to me 59, 60, the school districts, the local, you know, individual schools, they have some real contorted lines that would cut you out and move you to another school. So when my parents moved, I wound up just taking the public bus back to the old school. Because I didn't want to, as a sixth grader, have to start going through a lot of stuff in my last year in elementary school. So that is a factor that you need to also overlay, is how you could live right up next to a street, but the line for the school, which was just on the other side of the street, that would be the boundary.
Right.
And then two, you didn't mention straw man transactions.
What?
Straw man.
What is that?
What is that?
Can you talk about that?
You would hire a white person to
for
be
sure.
a purchaser for you with the guarantee that they would then transfer the property to you.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great.
Straw man transaction.
That's another great example.
I don't understand. I couldn't hear. I don't understand.
Oh, so I think what he's referring to. No, these are great points. He mentioned first about the racial gerrymandering of school district boundaries, which was totally happening in Pasadena. It was a mess, and it was it's a very it's a complicated history. But the bottom line, I think, was that there was a lot of resistance to school integration, and that was kind of the bottom line, and they were just finding ways to try to make that happen once Brown versus Board of Ed came down. And then he mentioned straw man real estate transactions, which that would have been a way to circumvent the
Covenants and restrictions.
well, and also the racial steering and the racist real estate practices. If a real estate realtor didn't want to show properties in an area, so let's say a person of color wanted to buy here in La Cañada, and the realtors said, would just not show them properties. What would sometimes happen is that person of color would get a white friend or somebody maybe working in civil rights or something to come and try to say that they wanted to buy the property, and then they'd get shown everything, and then they would, in some cases, even buy the property and then transfer it over to the person of color. So that was a way of kind of circumventing the practices. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
First, I want to thank you for bringing this fine presentation to our community.
All right.
It really is important because these are issues that are still prominent. Our school districts are dealing with issues of diversity. I'm a 20-year resident of La Cañada. I noticed here in 2010 census we had 40 African Americans. My family was counted among that 40. And I think it's very important for those that are sensitive to this issue to help our current school district that has resistance for issues of diversity. My son who graduated back in this period of time, I guess in 2010 actually, we graduated from high school, but the first semester of junior high, I thought of taking him out because there was so much negative energy coming toward him because he was an African American. And on his last day, last week of school, graduation time, he was a stun gun was used against him in a racial incident. That would have been year 2010. So we're still struggling with this in our community. And so it is very important for those of you that are sensitive to it and who really care to realize that it's hard to tell now what direction we're going in terms of the census. I see here in the year 2000 we had 103. Last year, 2010, we only had 40. I don't know the result of the 2020 census if we have less African Americans. But this is a very, very important issue for those of us that are just seeking equity, and especially equity for our children.
Yeah, thanks.
When I purchased my property in 2010, I wanted to mention when my title documents finally arrived to my, in 2002 actually, for 20 years, when my title documents actually arrived, though illegal, the covenant against selling your property
Were you able to do anything or? Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
It's illegal. It has no effect because it's illegal in law. That covenant is still in the document, or was in my title in year 2000.
I just wanted to mention, kind of ripping off some of your points, that I've been in La Cañada since 2005, and one of the things I've noticed over the years, but particularly with the surge recently, is in our elections, the school board and city. If these issues matter to you, really read carefully people's platforms, because you will see, in my opinion, that there are people who are trying to perpetuate these things, and then there are people who are trying to end them. So we do have a school board election coming up, and I think if you really look at people's platforms, you'll be able to see, draw your own conclusions.
And tomorrow is a school board, there's going to be a forum at the high school tomorrow at 7. So if you care
Great.
about things, please show up.
Yeah. Great, great.
I was just wondering if the Lanterman tour includes any of this information. So when our children go through the tour, I think, what is it, in 3rd grade they all do that. Are they made aware that Mr. Lanterman was had such a pivotal role? And I don't, yeah, I mean, I think it's important for them to be educated, and it's nothing to shy away from, but it should be used as a teaching tool.
I agree. We're talking about how to incorporate that chapter of the Lanterman history. Sorry, I will use this. We are talking about that. This is a step in us educating ourselves and trying to figure it out. At the 3rd grade level, right now, most of our efforts are going into shortening the tour because we find that we can't currently hold their attention, and we actually don't go into the room that was set up as Frank Lanterman's office anymore. We have set a timeline for ourselves of 2026 to try to figure out how we reinterpret things and incorporate this part of our history. That also coincides with the city's 50th anniversary, so it seemed was something we could roll out at that time. So yeah, we're thinking and we're working on it, and I don't know yet what our results will be.
Just kind of along those lines, one of the things that Richard Rothstein mentions in this book, I don't know if any of you have seen this book, it's been on like the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while and stuff, but he talks about how maybe 3rd grade is too young for that, but he does talk about how in most middle and high school curricula, this stuff is just not taught, and especially the kind of the role of government. He says that he surveyed a bunch of high school textbooks. They tend to use a passive voice when they say that blacks were segregated. It doesn't say who did the segregating, doesn't mention anything about the FHA, the HOLC. So there's still, I think, a lot of work to be done to kind of incorporate this story. It's very contentious. There's been so much controversy around critical race theory, and we live in a blue state here, so I think we're not confronting that as much in California. But I obviously think there's a lot of value in knowing this past.
I'm curious. You mentioned one of the solutions being inclusionary zoning and mixed-use housing in communities, and La Cañada is in a space right now where that is something that's being talked about at the city council, and a lot of those code words are coming up again around safety and property values, and so I guess I'm curious, how do we both help ourselves and our communities have these hard conversations about both what we really mean when we say these things, but also what the city could be like if we actually created this different future that seems like it's been very resistant to for quite a long time.
I mean, just the way you just stated that is great. So just talking about it in that way is a great first step. I can share that. So I've been kind of watching Lakewood. I did Lakewood as one of my other case studies. And they, I feel like one of the really important first steps is to listen. Like you shared your example, you shared your example of your son and like your experience moving here. Just having a listening session. What they did in Lakewood, they had a town hall meeting on race. In the summer of 2020 with George Floyd. There's a pretty substantial Black American community in Lakewood, and what happened at that meeting was people showed up, and my God, it was like story after story of racist things that happened, of instances of discrimination or some slight or some horrible things, racial, profiling by the police, all kinds of experiences that people had their residents of the community. So just giving folks an opportunity to share their experiences, it might come as a shock, like to some members of the community. And then, I feel like that's such an important first step, to create a safe kind of space for that, a safe forum for that kind of expression, to just have a conversation to get that started. Because otherwise, I think the tendency might be to just say, well, there's no problem here, just not really recognizing what that reality of that experience can be like. Maybe it's not like that every day, but even if it's happening occasionally, it's something that ought to be kind of known and shared. So I do feel like, Kyle, I think you guys have a great opportunity to maybe start that and, to create like that kind of space for those sorts of conversations. And then, because it's consciousness raising. And then once that's happening, then, have the city council people come. I mean, the town hall meeting was sponsored by the city council in Lakewood. So they were forced to hear it. Not all of them wanted to hear it, but they did hear it, and they were trying to deal with it. And the amazing thing is Lakewood elected its first African American to the city council, who's a very progressive-minded person. So I feel like she's probably going to get in there and really start making some change. So, yeah.
And on that note, I'd like to introduce Kyle Sears from La Cañada Congregational Church, who had a flyer that he handed out. I'm going to talk about it.
Yeah, so hopefully you've seen these flyers. They were at the front table there. And I've got some extra here, but what we were thinking about is that probably we would want to have more conversation than just this afternoon would afford. And so next Sunday night, 6:30 at our church, we're going to have a dinner and discussion where we talk about race, housing, and history within La Cañada. I'm from Texas, so put food in front of people and maybe we behave ourselves a little bit. And so we'll have it catered. I just need to know if you plan on coming. And so you can RSVP on our website. And my hope is that in groups of 6 or 7 at each table, we talk about our experiences, we share some of our pain and our hopes, and maybe in sharing as a group, we come up with some plans on how to make our community an inclusive place for everybody. My hope also is that this turns into, we're also making plans for every weekend in February for Black History Month to bring in authors who can speak and share some realities that then allow us to continue this conversation. And so my hope is, our church was founded 125 years ago. The Lanterman family was one of the founding members. We have a deep history within this community, and I know that there's parts of the history that our church has failed to talk about. And so I thought, well, it's a nice round number, let's start talking about it. So I want to host as many people who want to come. We can fit a bunch of people in our fellowship hall with some food, and we can spill out outside if we have to. So yeah, if you want to come, if you don't have a flyer, come see me and I'll give you one. But I'd love for everybody here, and then if you've got family, neighbors, friends who'd like to come, we'd appreciate that too. So.
Cool.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I just had an observation about, you're talking a little bit about the role of teachers for oral history and that sort of thing. Well, I came to California in the 80s with my history degree in hand, searching for a history post in a high school. They said, well, wouldn't you rather teach English? Because after all, our coaches usually teach history. Because they can just give them the questions in the back of the book. So this, to me, does not bode well for much of our... And one of the things I wanted to ask, how many people ask what the certification of their kids' high school teachers are when they come to back to school night? And I think that's a very good question to bring up to the school board.
You're lucky to have teachers. I'm serious.
Yeah, that's
I'm really serious.
well, I ended up teaching English for years.
What school district? In what school district?
Here?
Oh, no, this was in Pomona and Upland.
Oh. Okay, I think maybe we'll wrap it up. I just want to thank you all for coming. You guys have been a really fun audience to talk to and great questions and insights. And I really hope the work continues, and you can invite me to any dinners or whatever. Thanks, everybody.
On behalf of the Historical Society of the Crescenta Valley and the Lanterman House, we're so grateful, Becky, to you for coming here today to talk to us. She's too modest to mention it, but her book is coming out.
I hope.
Oxford University Press. Follow her on her website, BeckyNicolaides.com, if you would like to pre-order a copy.
Oh, God, that's a little premature.
That's too premature.
I'd say within the next maybe year or so.
In a year. Okay. Maybe we'll have her back and do an author signing. We're so grateful. Thank you.